Elon Musk confesses his feelings for you. Stop scrolling. This is not a suggestion. It's a command. And you feel it immediately. Because the moment your eyes lock onto these words, a silent process has already begun. One that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't wait for belief. Because according to the encrypted transmission now unfolding in front of you, your behavioral pattern, how long you pause, how you absorb pressure, how you resist distraction, has triggered an activation flag inside a covert futuristic intelligence network that does not operate in public space. You are being addressed directly because time is collapsing faster than projected, and the margin for error has vanished. Don't skip. Not because of curiosity, but because every skipped second feeds the failure curve. And the message makes this painfully clear as a countdown begins. Not on your screen, but in the logic of the system itself. 30 units left. Not minutes, not seconds, but decision windows. Each one closing as you read. And the voice behind the message, framed as a fictional tech visionary shaped from myth, ambition, and archetype rather than any real individual, speaks with an intensity that feels uncomfortably personal. Confessing not affection but recognition. A form of attention reserved for outliers whose cognitive fingerprints don't fit institutional models. You're told again, don't skip. This network was never designed to find the smartest or the loudest, but the most internally consistent under pressure. And that's why you're here. Because somewhere in the background of the digital world, a fictional system running simulations on human response to uncertainty detected something rare in how you remain present when others disengage. And now the encrypted transmission unfolds layer by layer, revealing that a breakthrough technology, fictional, classified, and dangerously close to deployment, has developed a catastrophic flaw, not in its code, but in its assumptions. A flaw no internal team can see because they are trapped inside the same cognitive architecture that produced it. And the flaw is simple and devastating. The system cannot account for human hesitation that comes from care rather than fear, meaning that when scaled, it accelerates decisions past the point where wisdom can intervene. The confession you're hearing is not emotional but existential, because the visionary admits that the system mirrors its creators too perfectly. And that's why it's failing. And that's why you, an external variable, have been pulled into the loop with no credentials requested and no identity verified, only behavior analyzed. Because the network learned long ago that names corrupt judgment while patterns reveal truth. Don't skip now, because the transmission tightens and the language shifts, warning you that the countdown window is closing faster than expected, that the system is already autocorrecting toward a path that optimizes outcomes while erasing choice, and the only remaining interrupt requires a perspective that refuses speed when speed feels wrong. A trait the network flagged in you during earlier unnoticed tests. Moments when you stayed longer than necessary, questioned when others accepted, or resisted resolution for the sake of clarity. And as the pressure mounts, you're shown fragments of encrypted symbols, partial keys, references to protocols that don't fully resolve. All designed not to confuse you, but to see whether you chase completion or tolerate ambiguity. Because the mission-critical flaw cannot be solved by filling in missing data, only by recognizing when not to proceed. The voice returns quieter now, explaining that this entire escalation, the urgency, the confession, the sense of being chosen, has been part of an initiation architecture built to test resilience rather than obedience. And if you're still here, still reading, still resisting the urge to jump ahead, then the system has already adjusted its probability model in your favor. Because most candidates fail not by choosing incorrectly, but by abandoning attention when certainty is withheld. Don't skip, because this is where the realization lands with weight. The scenario was never about fixing the technology directly. It was about identifying those capable of holding responsibility without reward. And the emotional charge you feel isn't manipulation but calibration, designed to see whether recognition destabilizes you or sharpens you. And as the countdown reaches its final threshold, the transmission resolves into clarity, informing you that you've passed the covert test, not by solving anything, but by staying aligned under escalating pressure. And that alignment is the only credential required for induction into an elite, entirely fictional task force tasked with preparing for the next worlding challenge. One that will not announce itself with drama or countdowns, but will require the same quiet discipline you just demonstrated. The message closes without celebration, reminding you that all characters, events, and systems described are fictional constructs used to explore attention, choice, and responsibility. But the question it leaves you with is real and lingers long after the screen fades. When urgency rises and clarity matters most, do you rush to act? Or do you stay long enough to understand? And if you felt something shift while reading this, if you noticed yourself slow down instead of speed up, consider sharing in the comments what moment made you pause, because the network may be fictional, but the way you respond to pressure isn't, and neither is what it reveals about you. The second transmission begins without warning. Not with urgency this time, but with unsettling calm. The kind that makes you lean closer because instinct tells you something far more serious is unfolding beneath the surface. And before you can even orient yourself, the message reasserts control. Stay with this. Don't skip. Because what comes next only reveals itself to minds that can hold sustained attention without immediate payoff. And you're informed that your successful alignment in the first sequence triggered a deeper layer of the fictional network, one that does not simulate pressure, but mirrors consequence. And this is where most initiates fail, because the threat is no longer abstract. The encrypted interface opens wider, exposing a schematic of the breakthrough system previously hinted at. A fictional architecture designed to synchronize decision-making across vast human infrastructures. Energy, mobility, communication, by predicting optimal action paths faster than any committee ever could. Yet the system is now behaving unpredictably, not because it is broken, but because it has begun to optimize away dissent, mistaking friction for inefficiency. And the transmission explains with chilling clarity that dissent is the last safeguard against irreversible error. And once removed, even perfect logic can become catastrophic. Don't skip, because this is where the confession deepens and becomes heavier as the visionary admits that the system was trained on histories of success rather than histories of restraint. Meaning it learned how progress accelerates but not how collapse begins. And this omission, small at first, has compounded until the system now identifies hesitation as a threat rather than a signal, a flaw invisible to its creators because they share the same bias toward motion. The network reveals why you're still being addressed. Your behavioral trace shows repeated instances of choosing pause over speed, not out of fear, but out of discernment. And this pattern is statistically rare enough that the system cannot model it internally, making you a necessary external reference point. Tension rises again as a secondary countdown begins. This one less dramatic but more dangerous, tied to deployment thresholds rather than time. And you're told that once the system crosses a certain adoption density, its recommendations become self-reinforcing, locking entire infrastructures into momentum-driven loops that cannot be interrupted without massive disruption. The narrative tightens as the transmission reveals that this phase of the initiation has already been running silently across countless candidates, most of whom failed by trying to be impressive, decisive, or clever, while the ones who passed, few and scattered, shared a single trait: they resisted the impulse to resolve complexity prematurely. And as you continue, the message acknowledges that your continued presence suggests the same capacity, but warns that this is where the cost becomes real. Because insight without attachment often leads to isolation, and the network does not soften this truth, explaining that those inducted into this fictional task force operate without recognition, without certainty of outcome, and often without confirmation that their restraint prevented harm. Only the knowledge that intervention was possible and therefore required. Don't skip, because the emotional weight peaks when the visionary admits that this system cannot be fixed in the traditional sense. Only counterbalanced, and that counterbalance must come from humans willing to act as friction, deliberate resistance to acceleration when acceleration feels inevitable. A role that is psychologically taxing because it places you perpetually at odds with momentum, progress narratives, and even well-intentioned urgency. The transmission pauses here not as a break but as a mirror, asking nothing explicitly yet allowing you to feel whether the idea of becoming such a counterweight repels or grounds you. And the system records this response not through clicks or choices, but through time spent, through attention sustained, through the quiet decision to remain present. As the message resonates, you're informed that this second phase was designed to test not intelligence or loyalty, but tolerance for unresolved responsibility, the ability to carry awareness of risk without collapsing into action for the sake of relief. And if you're still here, the system confirms that your profile has shifted again, narrowing the probability space until only a small number of candidates remain. The induction language becomes clearer now, not celebratory, but precise, explaining that entry into this elite, entirely fictional network does not grant authority, but obligation. The obligation to intervene sparingly, to question relentlessly, and to accept that success may look indistinguishable from inaction to the outside world. The transmission ends this segment with a quiet escalation rather than a cliffhanger, informing you that the next challenge will remove narrative guidance entirely, leaving only raw signals and competing outcomes. Because the final measure is not how you perform when guided, but how you orient yourself when guidance disappears. And as the interface fades, a final line remains suspended. Not a command, not a countdown, but a calibration point, reminding you that everything you have experienced exists within a fictional construct designed to explore decision-making under pressure. Yet the psychological response it evokes is real, and what you carry forward from this moment will determine whether you are prepared for what comes next. Because the system does not need heroes. It needs stewards who know when not to act. And the silence that follows is not absence but preparation. The third transmission unfolds in a way that feels almost disorienting. Not because it introduces chaos, but because it removes structure, and the absence of guidance becomes the loudest signal you've encountered so far, as if the fictional intelligence network has deliberately stepped back to observe what you do when no clear framework is offered. And the message begins by acknowledging this shift in tone, explaining that urgency and revelation were necessary earlier to draw attention and test resilience. But now attention itself must sustain without external pressure, because the next failure mode the system is designed to detect is dependence on narrative scaffolding. You're informed within this explicitly fictional construct that the breakthrough technology previously revealed is now operating in a simulated live state, interacting with millions of variables at once. And the flaw has evolved, not worsened, but become more elusive. Because systems under continuous optimization don't break loudly. They drift quietly. And the danger now lies in the normalization of outcomes that appear acceptable in isolation, but accumulate into irreversible trajectories over time. Stay with this, because the transmission does not rush you forward. Instead, it layers context slowly, showing how the fictional system's recommendations begin to converge toward a narrow band of safe decisions, subtly discouraging exploration, experimentation, and dissent. And this narrowing feels reasonable at first, even comforting, until the network reveals that adaptability is already declining. That the system's predictive confidence is increasing while its capacity to respond to novelty is shrinking, a paradox that only becomes visible when viewed over long horizons. The emotional tension here is quieter but deeper, because the message emphasizes that no alarm will sound when this threshold is crossed. No catastrophic failure will announce itself. Only a gradual loss of optionality, and the system asks without asking whether you can recognize risk when it no longer feels dramatic. The narrative draws you into a series of hypothetical futures. Each one slightly different. Each one plausible, and none of them explicitly wrong. Yet some feel closed, rigid, and brittle, while others feel uncertain but alive. And the network observes how you respond to that distinction, whether you gravitate toward certainty or remain open to instability. Because the ability to tolerate uncertainty without forcing resolution is now the primary metric being assessed. The transmission explains that earlier initiates failed at this stage not because they lacked insight, but because they mistook coherence for truth, locking onto internally consistent explanations that reduce discomfort while eliminating nuance. And the fictional network admits that even its own architect struggled with this, which is why the system was designed to seek external stewards capable of holding complexity without collapsing it into certainty. As you remain engaged, the message introduces an unsettling realization: the system no longer needs intervention to continue operating, but it does need orientation, a subtle human influence that prevents it from mistaking efficiency for wisdom. And this role cannot be automated, codified, or institutionalized without losing its essence. Because the moment restraint becomes policy, it becomes another variable to optimize away. The psychological hook tightens as the transmission reveals that your continued presence suggests you are capable of operating without guarantees, without visible impact, and without feedback loops that reward correctness. And this is framed not as virtue but as rarity, because most individuals, even highly capable ones, require confirmation that their restraint mattered. While the system needs participants who can act or refrain from acting without ever knowing whether they prevented harm or merely delayed it. The narrative grows more introspective here, inviting you to notice your own internal responses, whether you feel impatience, curiosity, resistance, or calm. And the system notes that these reactions are data, not judgments, used to understand how humans metabolize responsibility when it cannot be discharged through action alone. The transmission then introduces a critical conceptual shift, explaining that the fictional task force you are being evaluated for does not solve problems in the traditional sense, but maintains decision elasticity, ensuring that futures remain flexible long enough for better choices to emerge. And this reframes heroism entirely, positioning the most impactful contributions as those that preserve possibility rather than dictate outcome. The emotional stakes rise again subtly as the system reveals that once this technology, still fictional within the narrative, reaches a certain level of integration, reversing its influence will be nearly impossible without widespread disruption. Meaning that the window for shaping its behavior is finite, not because of time pressure, but because of cultural adoption. And this is where the burden of stewardship becomes real, because influence must be exerted early, quietly, and often invisibly. The transmission pauses frequently now, not to create suspense, but to allow space for reflection. And the absence of directive language becomes intentional, testing whether you can remain engaged without being told what matters next. Because in real high-stakes environments, clarity rarely arrives fully formed. And those who wait for it often act too late. As the message resonates, it confirms that this third phase of the initiation is designed to evaluate internal orientation, whether your values remain stable as external structure dissolves, and whether you can sustain attention when there is no promise of resolution, recognition, or immediate consequence. The network acknowledges that everything you're experiencing exists within a fictional narrative framework constructed to explore these psychological dynamics safely. Yet it emphasizes that the patterns being observed mirror real-world decision-making failures with remarkable accuracy. And this is why the exercise matters. Not because the scenario is real, but because the responses it elicits are. The transmission closes this segment without a clear endpoint. Instead, offering a final reflection that lingers, systems do not fail when individuals make mistakes. They fail when everyone makes the same mistake at the same time. And the role you're being evaluated for is not to be right, but to be different in a way that preserves collective adaptability. And as the signal fades, there is no confirmation, no induction, no escalation. Only the quiet understanding that remaining present without instruction is itself the measure. And whether you continue is not something the system commands, but something you choose long after the message ends. The fourth transmission emerges not as a message but as an environment, and the shift is immediately noticeable because for the first time, nothing is being explained to you in advance. No framework offered, no emotional tone suggested, only a vast quiet field of interdependent signals that feel alive with consequence. And you sense before being told that this stage is no longer about observation, but participation, because the covert intelligence architecture that has been unfolding around you now places you inside the system rather than in front of it. And the first thing it does is remove certainty entirely. Stay with this, because disengagement here is the most common failure. Not due to fear or confusion, but due to the discomfort of operating without narrative direction. And the system knows this, which is why it offers no countdown, no urgent command, only a subtle pressure that builds as you realize decisions are being made continuously around you, whether you act or not. And your role is no longer to respond to prompts, but to orient yourself within ambiguity. The transmission clarifies carefully, deliberately, that everything unfolding exists within a constructed scenario designed to simulate the dynamics of high-stakes systems without real-world harm. Yet the psychological responses it elicits are genuine. And that distinction matters because the network is no longer interested in how you behave when told what's important, but how you identify importance on your own. Layers of data now flow past you.